Howdy, Snowflake Science. I'm going to talk about ecological niches.
Adaptations, they will thrive. All that helps them to survive. Behavioral to hunt at night. Physical vertebral ties. Organisms have a role, a niche that they do call their own. Animals fighting for it all their life. They are struggling so they don't die.
So the science understanding we're going to address, ecosystems include populations of organisms that each fill a specific ecological niche. Describe a niche in terms of key indicators within the ecosystem, including habitat, feeding relationships, and interactions with other species. So an ecological niche of an organism or population is the role that species or population plays in the ecosystem. So each species or individual organism has a specific role in an ecosystem. The niche includes things like the food sources that are consumed by the organism, the habitat that it lives in, use of particular abiotic ecosystem components, and interactions between members of the same species or different species. Interactions between members of the same species we call intraspecific interactions, and between different species we call interspecific. If we look at this example over here, so here we have some barnacles. We have one species that lives at one area and a second species that lives in another area. So these are each in a different niche. So in this case, it's the habitat that's slightly different from below compared to above this line here. So there'll be slightly different features of the ecosystem at these different points, and that's enough for an ecological niche to develop. If we have a look at the dung beetle down here, so there's a resource in the environment, so in this case dung, and they're utilizing that as a food source. So their niche is to use the dung as a nutrition source, and that's what they do in the environment. That's their role. So that's their niche, the niche that they fulfill in the ecosystem. So let's talk about gum trees in Australia. So the habitat, it's mostly in Australia. You find eucalyptus in other parts of the world, but mostly in Australia. The abiotic components that they will use are things like sunlight, water, carbon dioxide, interactions with the same species, so they're going to compete with other gum trees for resources, and those resources are things like space in the environment, sunlight, water, carbon dioxide, insects for fertilization. So they're competing with those other members of the same species for those resources. Interactions with different species, so these are interspecific interactions. They provide food for koalas, depending on the eucalyptus species. They provide shelter for birds and other animals. They provide hollows for animal species when they die. And they release oxygen into the ecosystem, which is used by many organisms. So here are some components of the ecosystem that the gum trees use. So this is the niche that they fulfill. Competition occurs in ecosystems. It can occur between members of the same species, but also members of different species. So like I said, intraspecific is within a species, inter is between a species. And the resources that might be competed for are things like space, food, water, sunlight, but also within a species, things like access to females for mating. So down here we have some kangaroos that are competing with each other. So they're two males, they're fighting. They both need resources in the environment. They both need food, they both need water. But in this case, they're fighting for access to females. So within the species, we have this competition. Interspecific is competition between members of different species. So here we have a lion and a hyena that are fighting. They're fighting for things like food, usually. So access to animals as a food source, but also space too. So they have ranges that might overlap, and if they overlap, then they're going to compete with each other for the resources within those ranges. Now, competition with a niche is biggest between members of the same species because they have the same requirements in the ecosystem. So there's a lot of competition between members of the same species because they need the same food, the same amount of water, the same amount of space. So that's something to think about. The competitive exclusion principle is that you can't have two members of two different species competing for the same resources. So you can't get coexistence between two species if they're after the same resource. One will outcompete the other. A good example of this is squirrels in the UK. So the traditional squirrel in the UK is a red squirrel, like this guy over here. But in the late 1800s, early 1900s, the grey squirrel was introduced. We can see the grey squirrel is slightly bigger. They're both competing for the same resources in terms of food. They're both competing for the same areas as habitats. So we get competition between them in the ecosystem. And in this case, the grey squirrel is outcompeting the red squirrel. So red squirrels are becoming more and more rare, and grey squirrels are becoming more and more common. They're both competing for the same niche, but only one species can exist in a niche at a time. So to avoid competitive exclusion, we get species moving into different ecological niches. They might migrate, or they simply go extinct. They can't survive in the ecosystem anymore, they don't get the resources they need, so they disappear. By moving into different niches, you can get species that require similar resources to coexist within an ecosystem. So here's an example of lizards in Puerto Rico. So they're living in big trees, but they're living in different species of trees, and also we've got a lizard down here that's living in cactus. So each habitat has slightly different, can provide slightly different things to the lizard. So there might be different food sources up high compared to down low. There might be different protective strategies if we compare the cactus to the big tree. So although the lizards will have similar requirements, because the niches are slightly different within the habitat, they can coexist without going extinct. Let's talk about niche overlap. So if the niches of two species overlap, then the degree of overlap can determine the outcome for the two species. We've talked about competitive exclusion, so no two species can occupy the same niche, but if the amount that they overlap in the niche is very small, then they might be able to coexist. So if the species have a large overlap, so if we look at species A and species B down here in this graph, we can see there's this large overlap between species A and species B. Now this is body size down here, but it could be things like access to water, access to food, height in the ecosystem. It could be many, many things. Since the overlap here is great, the amount of competition between species A and B for the same resource is going to be quite high. So what will happen is one species might be able to migrate away, but usually what will happen is one will just be outcompeted and die off. So species B might be able to outcompete species A. The numbers of species A will decrease and species B will overtake species A in the ecosystem. The niche overlap is small, so if we compare species B and C here, we can see there's this very small niche overlap, then they may be able to coexist. So the niche that's overlapping, it might be something like body size. The body size overlap might be very small, and therefore they can coexist in the ecosystem. Here's a good example over here. So here we have two bird species. One hunts at night, one hunts at day. They're both existing in the same niche. They're both after the same food source. But since they have different hunting behavior, they can overlap quite happily without outcompeting each other. So that's a good example of niche overlap. So what happens if you have two similar niches that exist in different places on the world? One thing that can happen is this thing called convergent evolution. This is where you get evolution occurring to solve the same problem in different ecosystems with similar niches around the world. So you get similar animals evolving since the structures that evolve are useful. So let's look at an example of the dolphin and the shark here. How are the dolphin and the shark different, but how are they similar? So if we look at our dolphin and our shark here, we can see they both have two of these pectoral fins. We have a dorsal fin. The body shape is similar, the coloration is similar, so light on the bottom, grey at the top. There is one difference, the tail direction. So in sharks the tail is vertical, whereas in dolphins the tail is horizontal. But we have similar structures evolving because this is a good solution in an ecosystem in terms of helping the shark or the dolphin to access food. We see this a lot in Australia because Australia's been isolated for a long time. So animals in Australia have evolved similar solutions to existing in ecological niches than they have in other places in the world. So if we have a look at the wolf and the Tasmanian wolf down here, the Tasmanian tiger, there's often a top predator in an ecosystem that is something with big teeth that hunts smaller things. So we get wolves in America and Europe, and we have the Tasmanian tiger in Australia. So you get a very similar structures. So they're fast, they have sharp teeth, but in this case this is a marsupial, so it has a pouch that its young goes into, and this is a eutherian mammal, so it's a placental mammal. It gives birth to live young into a placenta that are reasonably well developed. So with convergent evolution we can see similar solutions being arrived at by evolution to solve problems in terms of fulfilling ecological niches around the world. And it's really quite interesting to look at. So today on Flipping Science we looked at ecological niches. That's it for Flipping Science today. See ya!